very happy to turn over to Emily Gillingham from Oxfam, who's going to introduce the rest of the panel and kick off the discussion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Claire. My name is Emily Gillingham. I work on Oxfam Policy and Practice, where we share Oxfam's research and programme learning with the sector. And I'm standing in today in place of Caroline Sweetman, who is the editor of the Gender and Development Journal and wasn't able to be here today, unfortunately. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our expert panels and to have teamed up with ODI to launch a special issue of the Gender and Development Journal, specifically looking at a first cut feminist analysis of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you know, the 2030 process has seen an unprecedented mobilisation of advocates for women's rights and gender equality, working to ensure the inclusion of a strong gender perspective in those goals. And as we move to implementing the SDGs, the real story is only just beginning. And it's this that we'll explore in this panel discussion, and which is also in the new issue of the Gender and Development Journal, which you can access at genderanddevelopment.org, on the Taylor and Francis website, and at Oxfam Policy and Practice. If I move on to extend a warm welcome to our panellists, I'd like to introduce Valeria Esquivel, who is Research Coordinator at the UN Research Institute for Social Development. And Valeria co-edited this issue of the journal with Caroline. We'll also have Jessica Woodruff, who many of you will know as Director of the Gender and Development Network. Elizabeth Stewart, who is Research Fellow here at ODI. And Sakila Sifilani Ngoma, Executive Director of the Women in Politics Support Unit in Zimbabwe. And Jessica, Liz and Valeria, who all contributed articles to this issue of the Gender and Development Journal. We're going to begin by hearing from each of the panellists on their perspectives of the nexus between gender and development, and then open up to Q&A. And I would encourage you to continue to tweet on hashtag Gender Day. And if you are joining us online, then please submit your questions, and we'll come to those at the end. So if we first hear from Valeria. As I said, she's a research coordinator on gender and development at the UN Research Institute for Social Development. She co-edited this issue, and if you could just give us a quick top-line overview of the SDGs process and outline some of the core themes that emerged from when you put together this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be presenting this special issue of gender and development on International Women's Day, on the SDGs. And as you imagine, to have the journal in place for today meant that all authors had the challenge to do their first cut analysis on the SDGs from November last year to basically January this year in order to publish. So it's really our first cut. And you'll notice that many of the articles have as titles questions. So it is very preliminary. It is really, we will see in implementation, I think, the challenge, it will be revealed. But I will get there in a moment. Two characteristics of the articles that are in the journal. One is that authors come from women's organizations, from research think tanks, from academia, from international agencies, both UN and international NGOs, and have been, most of them, involved in the negotiations or in supplying, in working, providing background reports, suggestion for how the SDGs were going to be framed and the language of it. And some others will be involved in the implementation, as many of us within the development world will be in the next 15 years. The other characteristic that I think it has proved a right decision, editorial decision, is that we didn't focus on on specific themes. Like we didn't say, well, target 5.4 on unpaid care work and an article on that, or target on violence against women and girls, or because of course we have a gender goal 5, with several targets down listed in that goal, but we also have, fortunately, many places around the 17 goals and 169 targets in which gender considerations are present. So if we had followed that route, there would have been reinforcing silos. And that is something that this agenda is trying not to do. It's trying to be integrative. It's trying to be cross-cutting. So in that spirit is that all authors are selecting cross-cutting issues, sometimes paying attention to goals like the health goal, or like the in the case of Gabrielle Köhler, or like the peace and security, the peace goal in goal 16 in the case of Anne-Marie Goetz and Rob Jenkins. But in general, the idea was that these were cross-cutting attempts to read along the SDGs, along the Agenda 2030. And what we wanted to read was how will this, whether this, let's say, let's put it differently, whether these goals will work for women, or what we should do to make them work for women. And that is, again, we are at the end of, it felt in September that it was the end of a long negotiation process, open negotiation process, by the way, where, for example, the Women's Major Group had, and Oxfam had a strong incidence. And there are 2 papers in the issue about how the Women's Major Group and Oxfam did do that work. But in taking this view, we didn't want to focus on the past, on the implementation, on all the process that took us here, but on the future. On the negotiation, but on the future, on the implementation. So what do the SDGs bring to women? And when we know women do not inhabit only that identity, and we know that the situation of women, how women and girls live their lives, are their situation is shaped by multiple dimensions, one of those gender. So in thinking about whether and how the SDGs will work for women, we were all the time taking this multidimensional view of women. What are the strengths of some of the strengths there are many, but of the SDGs? There is a strong human rights language in the preamble. There are references to all the 1990s important international conferences, including Cairo and Beijing. There is this integrative vision in which the economic, the social, and the environmental have to come together. There is also a strong point and a strong difference as compared to the MDGs, which is the idea of an universal agenda. And that means both for southern countries and for northern countries who are signatories. It's not anymore a donor-driven agenda. And I think the other important characteristic, important strength, is the issue of inequalities, which I have to say Andres has helped put into the agenda, because it's not only poverty, it's not only others, somewhere else happening, although we know that poverty is an issue in many places, but also inequalities within and between countries. The weaknesses all are presenting some challenges to us all. For example, there is whilst there is a strong UN human rights language in the preamble, the goals are not framed as rights. It's not framed as right for water, not framed as right for social protection, not framed as women's rights. In fact, that was the initial proposal for Goal 5, and it's not there. Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be bringing in a human rights perspective. It is that is at the background and not as strong as one wanted. And I should say the other thing I think it's strong is that in terms of the economic, it seems that it's business as usual. There is a strong reliance on growth, even a target on 77% of annual GDP growth. There is only dear into decoupling growth from resource use. There is little said about international financial institutions, except for the fact that countries should be sitting at the table. But whether that bringing the countries to the table means that actually power gets redistributed is a big question mark. And also, the SDGs, the document, which is called Transforming Our World, makes explicit that the validity or underscores the validity of the Addis Ababa action agenda for action, and that agenda for action doesn't actually bring new funds. So the issue of how are we going to match this ambition, these important goals with funding, and where is that funding going to come is still a challenge. So the devil, as I said before, might be in the detail. And I think there are two issues that the authors repeatedly point out as the main challenges of implementation. One is the cherry picking. And you've heard, I think, this debate about whether too many, I mean, yes, UK's position was these were too many goals. I think it was good to have those, in particular because the goals provided 17 different platforms for discussion and negotiation, and that is something that's good in itself. But we run the risk of countries being selecting the goals they want to show progress on and forget about gender targets. So in the implementation, keeping the gender agenda, which is very progressive, there is going to be a challenge. And the other is the weak accountability mechanisms. And these mechanisms are going to be built. So I think that is the second challenge, although we have to say that because this is a universal global agenda, it's very hard to find the accountability mechanisms for that global agenda. And for example, we have a goal that says that inequality between countries should go down. But countries are going to report on their own domestic policies and not an international arena. So that's a tension. So to realize the transformative potential of the SDGs and to make it them work for women, we, women's movements, gender experts, the people in the room, we will have to engage in these complex processes that impact women's lives, and processes that are going to be political, not technocratic. I think that's a lesson from the MDGs, a strong lesson. This is not a technocratic fix. This is political. It's going to take place at many dimensions, at the local and the national and the international, and we will have to be there to protect the wins, the hard-fought wins, and to hope and to forge alliances with other progressive actors to push the most transformative aspects of the agenda forward. Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Valeria. I'd like to introduce now Jessica Woodruff, who is the Director of the Gender and Development Network. Over the last 2 decades, Jessica has had a variety of advocacy posts in the international development sector, focusing on women's rights and economic justice issues. And Jessica, we'd be keen to start off if you could share your thoughts on what the key opportunities and challenges are that the SDGs present for progress on women's rights.
Thank you. And happy International Women's Day, everybody. As a 4th-generation feminist, I really like today. And just to start off, I'm going to tell you a story about what happened this morning in my household, because without any prompting from me, my 14-year-old put on a green, white and purple ribbon round her wrist. So my 11-year-old went and put on some purple socks. The struggle continues. Liz and I actually wrote our article together, and Liz is going to talk about our article, which means I'm in the rather nice position of having had slightly longer to think about what I'm going to say than the others, because mine's sort of more up to date as of yesterday. And what I want to look at particularly is following from what Valeria said about looking at the cross-cutting structural barriers that the SDGs needed to address. I'm going to first think about overall what our opportunities are and how we can use the SDGs, but then I want to look specifically around the care economy and macroeconomics. So, first of all, the SDGs are not everything we wanted. Surprise. They're, after all, the outcome of tortured negotiations among nearly 200 governments, many of whom have highly dubious views towards gender equality and women's rights. So the fact that not everything's there really shouldn't come as a shock. I think, though, perhaps sort of more importantly, is that we should remember that there are much better documents, like the Beijing Platform for Action, and we mustn't lose those when looking at the SDGs. The SDGs need to be a tool for us, not a boundary. But having said that, they were better than many of us feared. So I think we should celebrate that gender equality is a goal in its own right, SDG 5, but also in the preamble, gender equality and women's rights are mentioned specifically, and in some places given the same kind of prominence as economic growth. Now, this isn't borne out throughout the rest of the document, but it is there in the preamble. The principle of keeping a standalone goal was really important, and there was a point where it looked as though gender might be subsumed under a sort of basket of disadvantages, and we fought hard against that, and well done all of us, because we won. The other thing is that there are issues in there which weren't recognised under the Millennium Development Goals, like violence against women. And again, that's something to be celebrated, I think. So there are definitely opportunities in there to be taken. The key now is what use we make of them. Will we let them define our work, or will we define their implementation? And I wanted to look really at 2 challenges. The first is the one that Liz is going to talk about, which is whether the SDGs will ensure that the needs, priorities and voices of the most marginalised are given precedence, the leave no one behind agenda. And this applies to the global north as well as the global south, and it needs to be accompanied by resources as well as rhetoric. But then the second one is whether these new improved aspirations, and I think they are new and improved aspirations within the Sustainable Development Goals, will actually be matched by new and improved methods, by the kind of social transformation that was actually needed. Is it going to be that the SDGs help women climb over the barriers that they face, or are the SDGs going to knock down those barriers? I think the reason why I particularly wanted to look at the care economy and the macroeconomy is because I think that is the area where the SDGs have least knocked down the barriers. And it's again not going to come to a shock to any of you, but the SDGs didn't really make very much progress in questioning the economic model from a feminist perspective. But as we know, that is actually what's needed. The way in which gendered social norms and economic policies interact with each other undermines gender equality and women's rights, as well as broader inequalities. And because of time, I'm not going to go into details as to why the care economy is so important, but those basic social norms around men as breadwinners and women as carers actually run through so much of what we all work on and so much of the SDGs. But let's start with the unpaid care target, because this was the one thing that I really got excited about. Under Goal 5, target 5.4 is on unpaid care. Now, this had to be fought for really hard. And I think it's one of the few targets that are actually really interesting as a target, partly because unpaid care work is so important to individual women. And we all know that the time that women and girls spend on unpaid care work prevents them from accessing other opportunities. And I think you probably heard more about that this morning. But also because it affects so many other things, whether it's education, whether it's early and forced marriage, whether it's occupational segregation, whether it's the care crisis that faced so many countries around the world. And also, importantly, that this care work isn't just childcare. And I think sometimes we in the North forget that it isn't just about childcare. This is about maintaining the existing workforce as well as the future workforce. This unpaid care work is basically about maintaining the economy and society, which is why I think it's so important. In the target, there are 3 elements that we can use. There's recognise and value unpaid care work. And roughly about 25% of the gross domestic product internationally is unpaid care work. Unpaid care work is equivalent to about 25% of gross domestic product, national income internationally, an enormous amount of economic activity that is not being defined as such. Recognising the care economy in policy making could be transformatory. The target includes the provision of public services, infrastructure and social protection. Again, really important because it takes unpaid care work out of the realm of the household and makes it the responsibility of the state. And finally, it talks about the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and the family norm and the family. So that's basically telling us that we have to challenge the social norms around who does unpaid care work. So then my final point is around women's economic empowerment. Because as I say, what the SDGs don't do is they don't tackle the macroeconomic model. So while under Goal 5, you've got violence, you've got political participation, you've got sexual and reproductive health in there, the women's economic empowerment targets are spread all through the document. They have no kind of coherence to them, and they're also don't really challenge the status quo. The interesting thing here, and this is the new bit, is that there's going to be a high-level panel on women's economic empowerment related to the SDGs, which includes the likes of the head of the World Bank and the IMF. It also includes trade unions and corporations, sadly not in equal numbers. But it's a very high-level panel, and it gives us the opportunity, I think, to try to challenge, through this work on women's economic empowerment, some of the macroeconomic models. And I just very quickly to flag up a couple of the things that could be done under that again, as I said, around tackling the gender social norms, around male breadwinners and women as carers, recognising that fiscal space can be expanded through progressive taxation, investment in social infrastructure, which would reduce unpaid care, provide quality jobs, and it's self-sustaining. Looking at decent work, looking at the primacy of human rights agreements over trade and investment agreements, and I think really importantly, looking at the role of the private sector on this panel and in fact in the SDGs more generally, questioning the role that corporations have had in the decision-making process and suggesting that the role of the private sector on this panel and in other places should be at improving their own impact on women's economic empowerment and gender equality rather than as sort of potential philanthropists. So do I think the high-level panel is going to do all of this? Of course I don't, but I think it's worth a try. And the Gender and Development Network is working with the Bretton Woods Project over there to try to do some of this, as well as with our working group. One of the things that came out in a couple of the articles, Valeria's and some others, was the importance of alliance building in our response to the SDGs. We're building an alliance, and we're very happy to work with anyone else who wants to join us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. We'll come back to you in a moment, I think, on your article. We're now going to hear from Elizabeth Stewart, who is a research fellow here at ODI, and Elizabeth leads a team at ODI that works on the Sustainable Development Goals. You've done a lot of work around the principle of leave no one behind, Liz, and I wonder if you could explain to us how this principle supports the achievement of women's rights through the SDGs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I'm honoured and delighted to be a part of this fantastic, fabulous day. It feels like such an exciting day, and I know at lunch everyone was kind of buzzing with energy about this issue. And I heard Claire, you've committed already, haven't you? This is going to be an annual thing, so yeah, it's very exciting. I am also really excited, genuinely excited about the opportunity that the Leave No One Behind agenda provides as an additional tool, an extra tool to provide affirmative action for women and to start helping deliver on women's rights, but also improving gender equity. Very briefly, I'm not going to give a sort of long peroration on what exactly Leave No One Behind means, but just to make sure we're all on the same page in the room. The outcome document for the SDGs, it didn't have a specific goal on Leave No One Behind, but this language is shot through the agreement from the kind of the overarching chapeau, the preamble, and sort of sprinkled throughout all the different goal areas. And it talks about how there's a few concepts contained in this idea. Partly it's about looking specifically at marginalised groups and the specific challenges and barriers to progress that those groups experience. And gender was one of those groups, hence why it's relevant to this conversation. But it also contains within it the concept of fast-tracking progress within those groups. So it's not just about sort of improving outcomes, it's about making sure that the gaps between marginalised groups and the rest of society are closed, and they're closed quickly. And also the idea, and this is particularly exciting, that no goal will be considered to be met, or no target will be considered to be met, unless it's met across all those different group areas. And I should say that it sort of contains concepts of horizontal or inequality, so this is different group-based inequalities, but also within it is the concept of vertical inequality or income inequality, not least because income is listed as one of the slightly bizarrely worded groups. So it's a very cross-cutting agenda that is still, as Valeria said, I think it's a little bit up for grabs for exactly explaining and describing what it means. But I think let's have a maximalist interpretation of what it does mean, and let's be ambitious for it. I know some people feel uncomfortable with the sort of group-based approach when you're thinking about gender, that it could seem anathema to women's rights activists who've militated against the idea of women being a marginalised group, that this is a problem and an issue that's a society-wide issue. But I would argue, actually, as I say, this isn't instead of a gendered approach. This is an additional tool in the toolkit. And I think, actually, paradoxically, although we're talking about groups, I think it focuses on the individual and the very specific lived, idiosyncratic, unique experience that women face, and particularly when we're thinking about intersecting inequalities. So maybe a woman who's also poor, who lives in a rural area, or who comes from an ethnic minority, or who is disabled, for instance, and that the very specific circumstances of what it feels to live like in those conditions. So instead of thinking about kind of aggregate poverty numbers and sort of, poor people as being these atomized sort of conceptual things, I think it's very much brings it down to the experience of the individual. I'll give a couple of examples of what I mean. So some recent research that colleagues here at the ODI have carried out found that in Ghana, women who come from the groomer ethnic minority have a 23% possibility of finishing primary school. This was from 2008 data, whereas women in the rest of the society, other ethnic groups and non-poor women have an 85% chance of it. I think that's an extraordinary gap. Some other research that we've carried out recently looking at marginalised groups in different countries looked at Bangladesh and found that de jure single female-headed households, in other words, households headed by women who'd never been married or who were separated or divorced, were 1.5 times more likely to be living in poverty than de facto female-headed households, which means basically your husband or your partner were away, maybe they're a migrant worker. So again, it's, these are very fine-grained differences, and I think unpacking and understanding how these inequalities do intersect, how they pile one on top of the other, is really important for policymakers to not only understanding the problem, but understanding the solution. Another example, I think it's instructive to look at caste politics in India. So it's actually a caste-based norm that says that Dalits are the ones to perform the most degrading tasks in society. But it's a gender-based norm that says that it's women that manually clean out dry latrines. And you can't, nor can you assume that a solution that's going to deliver something for women and deliver something for Dalits will also be the right solution for Dalit women. And Hella Thorning-Schmidt, in her presentation this morning, made this point very well, that quotas that have been set aside in India on education and employment have been captured by more powerful women, and the quotas for Dalits have been captured by Dalit men. So, we need to have a much more nuanced policy response that I think the analytical lens of Leave No One Behind gives us. But to be a little bit more specific about kind of immediate policy responses that suggest themselves to the Leave No One Behind agenda, the first for me is data. I know, again, this has come up several times today already, but the gender disaggregated data is in a woeful state. You may be aware of the Data 2X project that was initially set up by Hillary Clinton when she was in State Department. And their explicit purpose is to identify the gaps in gender disaggregated data and start filling them. And it's explicitly for policymakers. This is not an academic exercise. This is for making better policy. And a study that they've done has shown that while 80% of countries do regularly produce quality gender disaggregated data on employment and on education, only a third of countries produce data on the things that matter to marginalised women. So on things like the unpaid work, access to informal labour markets, employment situations, and violence against women. So that's a significant gap. But I'm also confident that the political headwinds which have come behind the SDGs are starting to fill these gaps. So not only are organisations like Data 2X doing this, but we've now got the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. I know that, Sakila, you're going to talk a little bit about this later, that we now have at least the concept of disaggregation included in the indicator discussion for the SDGs. It may not be perfect, but it's there, and gender is one of the disaggregations that's been listed. And I think also it's I think now the understanding that the household is not the right unit of analysis or not an adequate unit of analysis is now, I think, started to become embedded. Secondly, of course, it's not good enough just to have the data. As I said, you need to see some policy change. And I think that, again, this analytical framework of Leave No One Behind, thinking about the barriers that marginalised women face, suggest a policy agenda, a policy response, and understanding that these, again, as I've said before, these marginalisations are overlapping, and so the policy responses may be overlapping. And some of those policy responses will be things like social protection, universal health coverage, but I think, again, there's also an understanding that some of them will be some of these more structural issues that Jess was talking about, so maybe looking at the structure of labour markets, for instance, that's going to be really important. There's also going to need to be behavioural change. This is a normative issue as well if we're talking about marginalisation, because a lot of it's also about discrimination. I'll be quick. I was talking to a colleague earlier who has been carrying out some research in Ethiopia, and he was in a rural area about 100 miles outside Addis, and he was talking to in a marginalised community, talking to a group of women, and they said that their lives had changed immeasurably in the last 10 years, and he was amazed and said, why? And they said it's because of gender empowerment projects, which I think is an incredibly positive message. And she said actually talking about putting these issues on the agenda, starting to talk about taboos, was having a tangible effect on members of that community, which I think was pretty amazing and underlines the point that women themselves, particularly marginalised women, need to be part of this policy discussion, identifying the right policies that speak to their individual experiences of marginalisation. One very last thing to say is, of course, some countries, it's the government itself that institutionalizes this kind of discrimination. And there, I think there's a wider value in the SDGs in that they're a global agreement, and it's about sort of global normative change, pressure coming from outside, which supports civil society domestically to make those kind of longer-term behavioural changes.
Thank you, Liz. Before we move on, I just wanted to just quickly return to Jessica, just as you both worked on the Leave No One Behind article, whether you had anything to add from a gender perspective.
So just a few points. It was great working with Liz on this. As you can tell, my hobby at the moment is working with people that I don't usually work with. But I think Leave No One Behind it's a fantastic objective. And what we've got to be careful about is what method we use to reach that objective. And I'm just going to flag up 4 dangers from a kind of gender women's rights perspective that I think we just have to kind of be careful of. And Liz and I have talked about these before. One is returning to the dangers of returning to a charity approach. That just the words, not leaving behind those that can't fend for themselves, kind of thing. We've got to be really careful that this isn't about that kind of charity approach. The second is to be careful that we don't lose the specific focus on gender-powered relations. We fought long and hard, and Liz mentioned this, but we fought long and hard for people to understand that we're not a group of people who need help. Gender is a form of organising society. It's a way in which society is structured, and we just need to be careful that analysis isn't lost within the Leave No One Behind agenda. The third point is that there's a lot that can be learnt, I think, by the Leave No One Behind people, so to speak, from those of us who've been working in the feminist movement. I mean, for example, the concept of intersectionality really was born by the women's movement. That understanding of the way in which class, gender, race, and so on interact with each other. And the final one is that one of those things that I think we've learned in the feminist movement is that supporting and empowering the most marginalised to exercise agency and to create change for themselves is what really works. And that should be the underlying principle within Leave No One Behind.
Thank you. It's now with great pleasure I'll turn to Sakila Siflani-Ngoma, who is Executive Director of the Women in Politics Support Unit in Zimbabwe. The Women in Politics Support Unit seeks to strengthen democracy and governance practices in Zimbabwe through encouraging women's participation in political office and as political constituents. Sakila, from the perspective of a women's rights organisation in a developing country, I wonder if you could share with us what you see as the opportunities in the SDGs agenda.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I think that the SDGs are a fairly unique thing. On one hand, they are a political statement. They're not something that a government must do. They're a political statement, and so with the political statement, there's only so much that you can do in terms of accountability, responsiveness, etc., etc. On the other hand, it's great that they're a political statement, because one of the things that's quite clear on working on women's substantive equality issues beyond numbers, so to speak, is that there is a politics to substantive equality, particularly at a local level for women. There's a politics about turning women from being passive members of society into active members of society, getting women to be able to articulate their perspective on what development means at a community level. And so the usefulness of the SDGs is that it creates political platforms, and hopefully we'll be able to design political processes to actually have the conversation, and have the conversation that responds to women's rights in particular, which I think, from our perspective, looking at what we had done with the Beijing +20 reviews, we from Southern Africa, so the SADC Gender Protocol last year as well, reviewing that, it was really difficult because we realized we were dealing with the politics of gender equality, and you couldn't get. There was a glass ceiling in what you could get to do. Yes, we'll count you more. So Zimbabwe, for example, we are currently enjoying or trying to enjoy the fruits of our new constitutional dispensation. And so we have a quota and the affirmative action measures. But the question is, beyond the numbers, what then? And it's a sunset clause, so it will go away in 2023. But the question is, what then for women? So at WIPSU, what we try to work on is to say, using the SDGs as a tool, how can you begin to get women at a local level to hold their local level form of government accountable and responsive to the SDGs, so that we don't make it a conversation for an elite conversation. Because it's about SDGs, about transforming how government does day-to-day business. And how government does day-to-day business, all of us can probably have suggestions and methodologies at a national level. But what will that mean for Elizabeth in a community? And that's where women's rights organizations, I think, become increasingly important. I think that in talking about making the SDGs real, women's rights organizations are going to be important because A, they will become de facto unions. They're going to unionize women in communities. They will be the power brokers between communities and their versions of local governance. Secondly, they are probably going to become the facilitators of local level platforms to actually change government administrative systems, to make those systems responsive to not just collective desires at a community level, but also women's collective desires at a community level. And that's going to be important for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to make women more visible. I think that it's great that there's going to be a lot of data, etc. It's going to make women more visible. Earlier on today, there was a conversation about data, and it was a conversation about, there was an example about maternal mortality. And in Zimbabwe, we faced exactly the same situation. 3 different sets of numbers, everybody's collected them, what's the issue? We had an interesting scenario where we actually couldn't even count the numbers because there was a new phenomenon in one of the districts, Chipinge, called BBA. Well, we were calling it BBA, meaning born before arrival. And basically, women were responding to the situation. Clearly, there was something happening at the district hospital. Women were dying, and women knew this. And so what did they decide to do? We're not going to go over there because there might be a problem. So you wait until labor is fairly advanced, and then you pretend that you're going to the clinic. Therefore, the clinic, your local level clinic, is forced to take you in and forced to give you the healthcare that you want, so that you essentially bypass the high risk of going to a district hospital. So we have people who are born before arrival. But that is not visible in your statistics. That is not visible in... and so that's what I think the SDGs offer us. They offer us an opportunity to begin to get a way of engaging with women that makes women visible. Secondly, I think one of the things is that it's an entry point to governance conversations that might, depending on your circumstances, I can speak for my circumstance to say, sometimes governance conversations are very difficult. But the SDGs offer opportunity to have very difficult conversations in very challenging governance contexts or fragile contexts, because ultimately people live there and women live there. And if people live there and women live there, we should be able to talk about it. And so that's what they offer. I think the other thing that they do is that they offer a tracking opportunity to see what are the tangible progressive rights realization things that a government can do to deliver on rights. They might not be packaged. I mean, I understand, I agree with Jessica that they're not packaged in that way. But if you look at it, it's basically asking for governments to make a plan. Okay, that might sound like every government has a plan, but what I'm trying to say is you are able to have a very practical, demonstrable process on what somebody is going to be able to do. And I think that's quite interesting. I think it's quite interesting. And one of the things that I wanted to raise earlier, because I was thinking of the conversations earlier, is I wanted to say that patriarchy recruits. I'd felt like wanting to say that since the morning. Patriarchy recruits, and it retains its recruits every day. And what do the SDGs offer us? It's not a feminist tool. You could make it one. What does a constitution offer women? It's another type of tool. What does law offer? But the point is, if you're going to be trying to deliver on women's human rights in particular, you're going to be working in the gray zone, which is the zone that is between the law, policy, and practice in a country. And that's what the SDGs offer. they offer us an opportunity to enter into those gray zones, because that's where women are located, and that's where your violations occur, and that's where you want real transformation. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the Q&A section now, and if you could start thinking of your questions. And we do actually have a first question already from Lord Raj Lumba, who has requested to ask first, as I know you have to go to the House of Lords afterwards, Lord Lumba. So please, there is a microphone here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's very kind of you to ask me the first question. First of all, I would like to say thank you to all your panelists who explained SDGs and the working of SDGs in very clear terms. My question is regarding widows. There are 259 million widows in the world, having 584 million children. When you add their dependents and family members, the number actually swells over 1 billion, which is 1/7 of the humanity on this earth. The United Nations actually accepted my lobbying regarding widows, and in 2010, at the 69th General Assembly, they adopted 23rd of June as International Widows Day. Now, why should they do that when they have already Women's International Day? The fact is that widows are actually victims of double discrimination. They are abused physically, psychologically, and sexually, and it's not just problem of India or another country, but it's a global problem. And therefore, as much as I welcome SDGs, and I'm sure they have covered quite a lot of areas, as explained by the first panelist, I am concerned that they have ignored widows in these SDGs or indicators or targets. Now, I further believe that unless widows are helped and widows are supported through the United Nations SDGs, will never be met by 2030. At least 4 or 5 of them will not be met. And therefore, if there is anything you people can do about it, because they are still considering indicators, and mention of widows should be included in the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. If I return to the panel, perhaps if we go in the order. A group of questions, okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Arif. I'm from Educate to Eradicate. This question is more to Valeria and to Elizabeth. I think that in September I sat in the Ford Foundation and I saw David Cameron and John Kerry and the presidents of Colombia and one other country commit to the Leave No One Behind principle. And then less than a few weeks after he returned, we had announcements that the Conservative government wanted to change the way we measure inequality. And all of these things that they are now putting into practice are not in with the theme of Leave No One Behind. So as a country that I think would assume that the SDGs don't apply to us, even though that we are one of the 193 countries that have signed up to them, how do we make sure that relatively developed countries like the UK, like America, actually stick to their principles and enforce the Leave No One Behind principle, because it's something that we very much need in this country?
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nazma Kabir. I'm from Plan UK. I'm still kind of looking to the Leaving No One Behind question. I think what I haven't actually heard, I mean, I heard a lot of good stuff there, but how do we actually address those kind of group of people, even the marginalized groups in the fragile countries or kind of conflict or post-conflict countries. I mean, the challenge is even kind of higher in those countries to identify the people they need the support, and also even collecting data from those countries is a big challenge. And the question is also, what does it mean in terms of investment or in terms of kind of resources or government commitment? Because I don't think we are really clear about that, and I think we have to do something differently than before in order to address those issues.
Thank you. We have one more in this round. No. Valeria, may I ask you to comment?
I think the transition from the MDGs to the SDGs, from that donor-driven agenda for developing or southern countries to a universal rights-based agenda is almost revolutionary, but it will have to be enacted. So in that sense, what you mentioned about your country is something that is going to happen in the domestic sphere. And again, this is not an issue for the development people only. And we have to be very strong on that. Only doesn't mean that it's out. It means that it's more than business as usual in terms of donor communities, in terms of different countries. One issue I would like to follow up on your, not exactly on fragile countries, but on collecting data, and something that also Liz mentioned. Because one interesting difference between the MDGs process and these one is that the indicators that are going to be signed off this month, at least what we know about the drafts that are being progressively being published, is that the indicators are there even if the countries are not collecting the data yet. So it's a very positive thing. It's not, no, we can't collect data on unpaid work because countries do not collect time use data. We do have the indicators, and then countries will follow. So I think that's an interesting issue. But of course, the inequality you mentioned, we have had the Gini coefficient for ages, and the Palmer coefficient. And now we have something that simply says that the 40% of the lowest income brackets have to grow, the income of those income brackets have to grow faster than the average. So if we are in a recessionary situation, that doesn't apply. And we know that crises are the moments when income redistribution, regressive income redistribution happens. And it says nothing about the richest quintiles, that indicator. So I think there is an interesting thing about the ambitions, the vision, the transformative vision, the many battles fought, the unpaid care work, this inequality, and the entry points we will have to find to keep on this debates and this implementation going. I think enormous challenges ahead for all of us, in the UK or anywhere else.
Thank you.
I just want to make 2 points. One is, even though you didn't address it to me, I'm going to answer your question, which is about the UK government, who of course is just as obliged to implement the SDGs as anybody else. And I just wanted to share with you a piece of work that's been launched today by the Women's Budget Group UK and the ITUC, which is the International Trade Unions Body, which is looking at social investment in OECD countries, including the UK. And the Women's Budget Group also does something which is called Plan F, where they do a kind of shadow budget. The F stands for feminist. And they do a shadow budget of the UK. But I think it's extremely important that we make alliances with people in the UK who are having exactly the same arguments with the UK government, and certainly around the work on the care economy and the macroeconomic economy, that's exactly what we plan to do. But if you are interested, do go to the Women's Budget Group website. You'll see more. And just on the widows question, I mean, in a sense, that's exactly what the Leave No One Behind agenda is and should be and needs to be. And it's this whole issue that we all know, which is that, yes, gender is very important as a single concept, around the way in which society is structured. But within that concept, we have to recognise that whether it's on the grounds of age, marital status, sexuality, whatever, particular women and groups of women's experiences of that gender discrimination will be different. And widows are a group that, within that group, widows are a group who have not had sufficient recognition, are starting to get more recognition, I would say. But Liz knows more about that.
Thank you.
So very interesting, the question of widows and why, as a group, they haven't been included in the SDGs. And it's not the only excluded group. I mean, LGBTIQI groups also wanted a recognition of sexual minorities who were also not included in didn't make it through to the final cut. I mean, this sounds like a cop-out, but I think this then becomes an issue for lobbying, probably in country. There is still some room in the indicator conversation, and even though they are going to be agreed this month, what's also clear is that it's going to be an iterative process. They're going to develop an as data methodology, and as I think there's additional advocacy out there saying there really is a very strong case for having an additional indicator or changing indicators. That can happen, but I think probably it's more about lobby and advocacy at the national level, because although we have our global goals, targets and indicators, the next process is now agreeing national level targets and indicators. And again, the SDGs are clear about talking about other groups as sort of locally or nationally relevant. And in countries where there are extreme situations of exclusions of widows, that is nationally relevant.
But on this issue, the UN has already recognized this group.
Yeah.
The other groups are not exclusively recognized.
Yes.
So from that point of view, I think this group actually holds a different status, and there should have been a mention of widows, especially in indicators or in targets, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yes, I agree, and I certainly recognise that there are, as you say, specific additional forms of marginalisation or discrimination, and as well as sort of practical, concrete problems that widows face. So I think, the goal framework now isn't going to change. There is some room in the indicator framework, but I do think there's more room at the national level for this to be recognised.
But it's not a national problem; it's an international problem, and. I'm sure you probably know more about widows' problem in Zimbabwe. And, many, all over the world, in fact, we have published a research very recently. A copy of that was presented to Ban Ki-moon on 17th of December. So, this problem, widows' problem is, although it is a marginalized group, but it's a huge group. And it has already been recognized by the UN. And from that point of view, I think it should have been included in one way or another in SDGs.
Thank you.
On the question, was your name, is it Afara? Have I got your name right? Arifa, sorry. So I was there at the event in New York. It was Liberia was the other country, and I agree there was a disconnect between what we were hearing there and what we were hearing in the UK not long before and afterwards. And actually it struck me, the Evening Standard had a front page story the very next week that had the expression "leave no one behind" in the first paragraph, that was talking about problems in estates in Streatham and Brixton. And again, I was thinking about this disconnect. So, again, I think the answer is it's about advocacy in this country to talk about the universal agenda and to hold the UK government's feet to the fire at the domestic level as well as the global level. I mean, there are big data gaps here. You wouldn't think it, but there are significant data gaps around school exclusion, excluded children, marginalised children, poorer children in this country, to name but one group. There are actually big data gaps in this country. So some of the global implementation issues and challenges are present in this country too. And for some more on the specifics of the changes that were made in the poverty indicator, my colleague Paola Lucci wrote a great blog on it at the time. So if you Google that and read that, and we see some more there. Also, the Office of National Statistics is about to start a consultation on UK-based indicators. So what should we measure here, and how should we do it? Again, with questions of things like disaggregation and monitoring, so it would be good to participate in that. And then, Nazmi, your questions about fragile states, which, I mean, it's a concept I didn't get to, but also contained in the Leave No One Behind concept is a Leave No Country Behind, which some countries like Brazil particularly fought for very hard in the negotiations, which is talking about inequalities between countries, but also specifically talking about, you know, the fragile states and the countries that always remain the poorest, the LDCs who've been listed as LDCs since the category was invented by the UN. You know, nearly all the countries that were there at the beginning are still there. There's been very, very little movement. So, I mean, what to do on it? There are some policy. We've got examples of policies that fragile states and conflict-affected states have managed to introduce fairly, and both introduce, implement, and get some results on fairly quickly. In fact, we're writing a paper on this right now, kind of early actions on the Leave No One Behind agenda, including for fragile states. And one of the things, for example, that Nepal was able in a short space of time to start measuring and then implementing gender balance and other kind of representational balance in national institutions. That's just one example. There are some policy measures that can be introduced. So it's not, I don't think it is at all a lost cause for those countries. The data question, part of it will be about just capacity building and making sure that national statistics offices have the resources to do household surveys on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. But it's also going to be about some kind of innovative forms of data gathering, which I think would be in the poorest states would be a combination of things like community-based monitoring systems and CSOs opening up and sharing their data, and then the National Statistics Office sort of curating that data. Sort of, it doesn't have to be perfect. Let's not let the best be the enemy of the good. It's better to have some data and be aware of its weakness than no data on this. So I think some unofficial sources of data, and then some of the big data pilots that have been carried out could be implemented anywhere. So things like poverty head counts, measuring, looking at what roofs are made out of, for instance, or looking at light emissions. The financing issue, again, the paper we're writing, we're looking at how much it's going to cost to deliver Leave No One Behind.
Thank you, Liz. So, Claire, do you have any comments on the 3 questions that we've had so far?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the question that was regarding the fragile context. I think that one of the things that's important is to also bear in mind that in trying to move from being a fragile state, there shouldn't be an excessive focus on the numbers in terms of women's participation, only either as they transition from negotiators into parliaments, but I think also a lot of focus around local government or local authority engagement and participation. And another thing that's quite important is that there's in terms of stats as well, or engagements around women, not to focus extremely heavily on to make women visible in the context of the violence, but not just domestic violence as it is, but rather public spaces, public violence, and not to restrict it to social and reproductive health rights, which is what you end up getting a lot of. But then, people are not projects and women are not projects, and so you then don't see them in other contexts. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for another round of questions if we have any. There's going over from the same row. Thank you.
Hi, this is Chiara from Christian Aid. Thanks a lot to all the panelists. It was really a good sort of review where we are right now and what the challenges are. I guess I have a question on the Leave No One Behind, which may be for Liz, but also Valeria. And Of course, I think it's really important that we need to understand better how intersectionality plays out in people's lives, what kind of policies we need. The example on the quotas and Dalit women is something we have encountered as well in our programs, which is really a glaring one. But I do wonder how we also keep the focus on like the universal measures, like the structural changes that we need that are going to deliver for the most marginalized. And I'm thinking about enforcing minimum wage that we know has raised the living standards for women because they're clustered at the bottom in terms of wages in the labor market, but also land rights, redistribution of land and ensuring those rights.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I think Chiara's partially answered my next question. Jess, I couldn't agree more about the need to recall the previous agreements and treaties on women's rights and to make sure that the work on implementation of the SDGs is always from the starting point of advancing on that prior point rather than as if we're operating in a world made fresh. But I wanted to ask a question just reflecting actually on the MDG experience, which we also shouldn't leave out. And I worked for, as some of you know, for many years on education. And education, universal primary enrolment, was one of the more successful targets in the MDG framework. And if you had to point to why, you would say, actually, sorry, everybody in the room, not much to do with people in rich countries, not much to do with development agencies, but it was because education became an electoral issue in a lot of African countries. So if we had to pick one issue that was going to become an electoral issue from the SDG framework and really be a spearhead, really drive forward progress, what would you pick?
Thank you. And just one more from that. There was another hand in that row. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Kasia Staszewska. I'm from ActionAid. Thank you so much for a really inspiring panel. And I was, really absolutely agree with what you said, Shakil, sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, about the fact that patriarchy recruits. And, I think that you also do justice to the talking about SDG framework as something that can be a tool, should not be a boundary. But also within a context, as you said, Jess, that it doesn't really question the prevailing macroeconomic model. My fear a little bit is that we can see actually gender equality being instrumentalized to actually sustain the model that produced and generates this inequality in the first place. And we're already seeing this, get more women to work, to boost their GDP, not necessarily to a great, decent work. So I would like to hear a little bit from you about what kind of key strategies do you see to sustain the political nature of this project, and that this SDGs can actually support the transformative work of the women's rights organizations like yours, Shakir, and what would you see as the key things to really look at?
Thank you. Some meaty questions there. If you could keep your responses brief. Thank you,
Yeah, on
Valeria.
structural change, can I be brief? I think your first question, your last, were all bringing us back to the structural dimensions of inequalities and gender inequalities, and maybe that was really the missing aspect of the MDGs, the idea that quick fixes on here and there would do the work, and we know that change is more complex than that, and we understand transformative change as transforming structural issues. It's not palliative. That is what structural change is, and that is transformative in reality. So I think that is, and we will, and exactly my paper, which I haven't presented. I was here introducing the issue, but my paper is about macroeconomics and structural issues and how much the dimensions of economic empowerment that appear in the SDGs look like those things that would help growth. So it's women helping growth and not growth helping women, it looks like. So we will have to reverse that. And so I think that, to me, and again, it's the critical issue that Ches was pointing, is that we need to forge alliances with those other progressive groups. It shouldn't be women's empowerment shouldn't be only women's issues, and that's, I think, crucial. But if you, to the answer of which would be my preferred policy, if we are not saying only, I mean, I would go for macro policy, but I think that there is momentum for care policies. We are at a place where all our past advocacy on putting care in the agenda is bearing fruit. But that putting care in the agenda, it shouldn't be the rhetoric of recognition only. That was 1995, well, 20 years here. So I think care policies, and we have target, as just mentioned, target 5.4, mentioning infrastructure, which is water, sanitation, mentioning social protection, and mentioning care services. So to me, that's the package I would go for everywhere, not only in least developed countries.
Thank you.
So just on leave no one behind in structural changes, because I think the point Chiara made is really important, that that with leave no one behind, that's only going to work over generations if we make the kind of structural changes that we're all talking about. And I just think it's interesting, the point that Chiara made about the living wage or universal living wage, that actually a minimum living wage is more important to close the gender gap than probably any other policy. And that's a good example of where we shouldn't get too siloed in gender work, that actually that's where the alliances come in. On the electoral issue, for me, really, really clear that it's unpaid care, but as Valeria said, unpaid care means a lot of different things. And the election issue that I would coalesce around is the public funding of care services. Just in exactly the same way as previous, you and others previously put the public funding of education on the agenda, we need to put the public funding of care services in all their different guises onto the agenda. And that's a perfectly feasible election issue in this country as well as in others. And my final one, just sort of coming back to Kaja's point about how we use the SDGs. And I think one of the reasons why I'm excited about the SDGs, and despite being bored with them as well, is that I think that the macroeconomic work brings together work that I used to do without necessarily a gender hat on, and work I'm doing now. But the point is that a lot of the very same issues, for those of us who work on gender, for those of us who work on other forms of inequality, all clash together with the macroeconomic work. And that's when the alliance building really becomes exciting and interesting. But my final thing that I think is really, really important for all of those who have spent the last 2 years spending far too much time looking at the SDGs is that it's time to take a step back now and remember just what it was that we thought was really important in the first place, and then use the SDGs to advocate for that. And I do think there's a very real danger that we now constrain our advocacy work by what is in the SDGs. They're just a tool for us and nothing more.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. Chiara, I mean, I don't have an answer to you other than, yes, you need to do both. Clearly you need to do both, and it's not going to be enough to do either or for all the reasons everyone's just talked about. On the Lucia, on the electoral issue, mine is similar but slightly different, and I would choose decent work overall, in part because it's the issue that poor people and marginalised people raise. So I used to work at Christian Aid and spent a lot of time in marginalised communities having conversations with people about, you know, what their aspirations were for their lives, and it was almost always having a job, and having a sort of job that was not necessarily in the formal sector, but something that you could rely on, something that you knew you were going to be earning enough money over a year, there was going to be some form of regularity about it. But it's also the transmission mechanism, I think, from the macro to the micro, so that I think makes it so important.
Thank you. And
I agree, Chiara, I agree with all the above that everybody said. I just wanted to flag two issues around co-creation and movement building. I think those are also going to be incredibly important. Co-creation, not just women's rights orgs, but multi-sectoral co-creation and movement building that I think is going to be quite necessary. I think also we need to pay a little bit more attention to not double burdening women in public office and in public spaces or in public processes. And that way we'll be able to begin to have an equitable sharing of accountability and measuring of responsiveness because I do think that it is pretty good that you have, your larger structural changes in, as Jessica said, that it meshes with the women's rights concerns, but you also need to share the burden equitably. And I think the last one is to say, there's the demographic dividend, like, Africa is rising, for example, and in our context, is to be very careful that it's not an extractive relationship. It's not, exactly that. It is not an extractive relationship. Unfortunately, I probably agree with Valeria, who spoke about, she talked about services as what would be an election issue. I think that looking at African governments, I would probably pick infrastructure. There's a huge infrastructure deficit on the continent, and that's where our policymakers are fixated on. I would say and if you look at what infrastructure means at a local level, it means something as simple as inter-village connectivity, and it's got a unique impact on women. So I would say we should jump right in there, and we should make that something that you are able to and deal with long-standing backlogs that have made women have to be extraordinary in doing day-to-day things.
Thank you, Sakila. Thank you to all the panelists for a really fascinating discussion. I would encourage you to go to Gender and Development website to access the articles that have been discussed here. And thank you very much.